Hello, I'm Michelle Levander, Director of the USC Center for Health Journalism. Thanks for joining us and welcome to our Health Matters webinar, Policing Race and Community Safety, 1 year after George Floyd. This month marks the sober anniversary of the police murder of George Floyd. As we honor and remember him, we'll reflect today on how police killings and the heavy police presence in minority neighborhoods can affect health and life outcomes, not just for those who come into direct contact with police, but for whole communities. And we'll ask the question, where do we go from here? The conviction of former police officer Derek Chauvin for Floyd's murder seemed to signal a possible new era of police accountability, but that optimism can be hard to sustain in the face of a deadly drum roll week after week as we hear of one police killing after another, often captured on video. Just in the weeks leading up to the Chauvin trial's conclusion, 13-year-old Adam Toledo, 20-year-old Dante Wright, and 16-year-old Micheal Brown were all fatally shot by police. Today, we'll explore the hidden price we pay for a criminal legal justice system that disproportionately punishes and kills Black people and other people of color. And we'll ask about whether there is a way to break these cycles of police violence. Our panelists will be exploring whether heavy police surveillance of neighborhoods in itself can be seen as a public health crisis. As part of our conversation, we'll examine the latest efforts to advance police accountability and public safety with equity and social justice as starting points. And we'll discuss how reporters can best cover this fraught and evolving story in original and powerful ways. You can tweet about the webinar at the hashtag #OneYearLater. Here to help us explore this urgent topic and provide ideas for reporting, we have three distinguished speakers. Frank Edwards is a sociologist whose work focuses on social control, the welfare state, and race. An assistant professor of criminal justice at Rutgers University, he explores the causes and consequences of the social distribution of state violence. He has published a detailed analysis of the prevalence of police-involved killings in the US, and we'll be discussing those findings today. His 2019 study showing police violence as the leading cause of death for young Black men has been widely cited. He also researches interconnections between child protective systems with police and jail systems and disproportionate family separations among families of color. He received his PhD in sociology from the University of Washington and joined the Rutgers New York School of Criminal Justice in 2018. We'll also hear from Andrea Headley, a scholar of public management, racial equity, and criminal justice policy, and assistant professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, and a visiting scholar of race, policing, and crime at the National Police Foundation. At the heart of her research lies the question, how can we create a more effective and equitable criminal justice system? She has studied ways to improve police-community relations in communities of color, assessed the effects of race during use of force encounters, evaluated the impact of body-worn cameras, examined the results of national police reform commissions, analyzed citizen complaint results, and explored the gendered norms and cultures in policing. She received her PhD in public affairs from the Department of Public Policy and Administration at Florida International University. Finally, we'll hear from Topher Saunders, who covers race, inequality in the justice system for ProPublica. Over the past year, he has done hard-hitting reporting on abusive practices and accountability failures within the New York Police Department. In 2019, he was part of a team that was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for public service and won the Peabody and George Polk Awards for the coverage of President Trump's family separation policy. In 2018, he and another reporter received the Paul Tobenkin Award for race coverage and the Al Nakula Award for police reporting for their multi-part investigation, Walking While Black, which explored how jaywalking citations are disproportionately given to Black pedestrians. His reporting has won other national awards, including a National Association of Black Journalists Award, an Online Journalism Award, and the John Jay College Harry Frank Guggenheim Award for Excellence in Criminal Justice Reporting. He's a two-time winner of the Paul Tobenkin Award for coverage of racial intolerance and discrimination. Topher is co-founder of the Ida B. Wells Society for Investigative Reporting, a nonprofit working to increase the number of investigative reporters and editors of color. He's a graduate of Tuskegee University and started his journalism career at the Montgomery Advisor in Montgomery, Alabama. We want to thank the California Endowment for supporting this program, and we also want to express our appreciation for donations to support this program from individual participants like you. You can tweet about this webinar at the hashtag 1 year later. A word about our format today. We'll be hearing from our panelists first, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. Because we have many people participating in the webinar, we'll ask you to write your questions into the Q&A panel of Zoom. You can write us there if you're experiencing technical problems as well. And we will be archiving this webinar and its PowerPoints later today at centerforhealthjournalism.org. Let's get started now. And Frank, can you just take us into a kind of overview and landscape of where we are today?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the invitation and everyone for joining us today. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the state of the field in public health and sociology as regards who is affected by police violence, the impacts of police violence on communities, and also help us think about how policing and state violence spreads across multiple institutions and cuts across different social groups. So I wanted to start us by kind of getting a sense of the scale of the problem, particularly regarding police violence. So this is a time series that looks at how many people were killed by police each month in the United States between 2013 and today, by month, right? And so what we can see here is a pretty steady trend, right? There's been a slight increase over time, but in the United States, police are killing about 3 people per day on average over these 9 years. Every month, police are killing in the US about 96 people. Every year, they're killing over 1,100 people in the United States on average. And these are data from fatalencounters.org. All of the police violence data I'm going to show you today comes from Fatal Encounters and is restricted to people killed by police use of force. Now, since the murders of Micheal Brown and George Floyd, we've still seen incredible volumes of people killed by police, right? Micheal Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri on August 9th, 2014. Since his death, police have killed 7,818 other people in the United States. Since George Floyd's death last year, police in the US have killed over 1,100 people. Now, in my research, I've looked at how the risk of being killed by police is distributed across groups in the US. One set of findings, we looked at the lifetime risk of being killed by police. So that is, if we think about how likely a person when they die is, how likely they are to have been killed by police over the course of their life when they encounter. Apologies. Here we're looking at results from a simulation study that uses demographic methods to think about what that lifetime risk would be using compressed data from 2013 to 2018. And what we show is that Black men have exceptionally high risk of being killed by police in the United States. That risk is about 1 in 1,000. Right, so over the life course, our study shows at 2013 to 2018 levels of risk, about 1 in 1,000 Black men in the US can expect to be killed by police. Risk is also pronounced for American Indian Alaska Native men and for Latino men as well. Risk is substantially higher than it is for white men. We see men's risk is typically an order of magnitude higher than women's risk. When we look at inequalities in the likelihood of being killed by police, we see clear patterns across race and gender. Black men are more than 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police, according to our estimates, than are white men. You'll see other estimates that put that number as high as over 3, and I think those numbers are consistent with our data as well. American Indian, Alaska Native men and Latino men are about 1.5 times more likely over the life course to be killed by police. American Indian, Alaska Native women and Black women are both more likely than white women to be killed by police in the United States. And this is a very clearly, this is a pattern of violence clearly structured by age, by sex, and by race. Here we're looking at the proportion of all deaths that are caused by police. So that y-axis shows us of all people who died at a specific age range, how many of them were killed by police. And we can see that this peaks for young Black men between the ages of 20 and 24 at over 1.5% of all deaths. So police are responsible for more than 1.5% of all deaths of young Black men in the United States between the ages of 20 and 24. Our research showed that police violence is among the 10 leading causes of death for young men in the United States. It's the 6th leading cause of death for men in the 25 to 29 age range. But we can see that risk is incredibly pronounced during young adulthood, especially for men, but young women are also at higher risk of being killed relative to older women. Now, US policing has broad negative health effects. So obviously, when we're talking about death, these are immediate and serious health consequences. But the impact of policing extends far beyond those direct effects, those kind of mortality effects. It has broad negative health effects on Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities in the US. So we know, for example, thanks to the work of Aliasa Sewell at Emory, that living in neighborhoods where police have killed people is closely linked to high blood pressure, obesity, and diabetes, and that those risks are higher for women. Living in highly policed neighborhoods, Professor Sewell has also found these relationships for other kinds of intrusive policing, for stop and frisk style policing, creates a series of stressors that really permeate throughout the community and create negative health consequences for entire neighborhoods. And when this style of policing is concentrated in Black and brown communities, as it almost always is, those contribute to racial inequalities in health, not just for the people who experience those police stops, but for the entire community. We also know that young men who are subjected to stop and frisk report much higher levels of trauma and anxiety symptoms and report symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. Amanda Geller has done a series of tremendous studies looking at the impact of NYPD on the mental health of young men in New York and has shown an incredible range of negative effects. It creates a sense of hypervigilance, right? Encountering police in this negative way triggers young men to respond with a kind of fight or flight mechanism as they kind of relive these traumatic experiences, which is precisely the thing that subjects them to more police scrutiny in the future, in addition to the kind of racial cues that police are using to single out young people, the racial age and gender cues that police are using to single out young people. This extends to test scores, it extends to all kinds of other things, right? But that experience of having the police treat you as an enemy, treat you as a dangerous person, and that experience of every time you see a police officer being fearful of having a violent interaction has tremendous mental health consequences. And we also know that people with histories of contact with the criminal justice system are less likely to seek medical help for fear of surveillance. Sarah Brain wrote a really novel paper that looked at how people who have criminal records think about coming into contact with institutions that they perceive may be in communication with the police. And she found that people who have histories of contact with the criminal justice system are less likely to go to a hospital when they're sick because they're fearful that hospitals will actively communicate and coordinate with police. This also extends to other systems. So for example, Kelly Fong and some really great new research has shown that mothers of children, low-income mothers of children, often are fearful of seeking out services that they're entitled to, like housing assistance, like food assistance, like other kinds of very important services, because they're fearful of being reported to child protective services, right? So this surveillance function of other institutions can negatively impact health through these kind of institutional mechanisms. But broadly, we can think of US policing as a pillar of structural racism in the United States, right? We know that policing and incarceration cause racial inequalities in health and mortality. We know that policing and incarceration cause racial inequalities in child development, family stability, housing and segregation, employment, and wealth. And we know that they distort democratic participation in election outcomes, right? Chris Eugen and Jeff Manza's study of the 2000 election and disenfranchisement in Florida showed pretty convincingly that had felon disenfranchisement not been the policy of the state of Florida, there wouldn't have been a contest in 2000. Al Gore would have won the election pretty handily. And we could think about how felon disenfranchisement in particular distorts elections. But the work of political scientist Veshla Weaver has been really informative on this question as well, as she has kind of clarified how experiencing the government as hostile, right? If you are living in an over-policed neighborhood, your most routine interaction with the government is with a police officer who treats you as something hostile, as something alien, as something dangerous, right? And that interaction profoundly structures your sense of belonging, your sense of citizenship, and your democratic participation, right? You learn that you are an enemy of the state in a really profound way. But policing is also tightly linked with other forms of state violence, right? We know that, for example, Cornelius Fredericks, a young man in Michigan, was killed during an illegal restraint. He was asphyxiated, similar to other chokehold related deaths or other inappropriate restraint deaths. Cornelius had a long history of involvement with the child welfare system in the state of Michigan. Micheal Brown was in a foster group home despite her grandmother's attempts to secure reunification and the availability of her grandmother to provide a safe home for her. The state resisted and kept her in unsafe foster homes where she was gunned down by police officers during a fight that occur all too frequently at these kinds of facilities. And so we need to think about how systems, adjunct systems like the child welfare system, like the health system, like the education system, all these adjoining systems relate to policing and create a network of institutions that engage in violence broadly, that engage in racialized violence broadly. So for example, in some new work I'm developing, we're looking at the risks of child welfare investigation across racial groups for US children in the largest counties of the United States. And we see incredibly clear inequalities across racial lines. So for example, in Wayne County, Michigan, Riverside County, California, LA County, California, we see Black children being investigated by child welfare systems at rates of over 80%. That means between birth and age 18, 4 out of 5 Black children in those counties can expect to receive a CPS investigation if risk levels remain where they are today. It's true in a number of counties. In all of the counties we looked at, the rates were above the national median, which is about 40%, which alone should stun us that about 40% of US children can expect to receive a child welfare investigation before they turn 18. This is an incredibly common occurrence. And this is an interaction with a state agency that has the power to break up families. I'm also looking in my research at how inequalities in one policy area might move into other policy areas. So this looks at who is reporting children for allegations of child abuse and neglect by age and by race. The green line represents Black children's levels of reporting. The red line represents American Indian Alaska Native children's levels of reporting. And you can see the legend on the right, but we see really clear patterns here. We know that Black and Indigenous communities are heavily over-policed and poorly served by local, county, and state police. And we see incredible levels at which police are reporting Black and Indigenous children to child welfare systems, particularly infants. We also see medical professionals reporting these children at incredibly high rates, and many of those are related to mandatory drug testing during neonatal and during delivery of infants. These often result in the separation of infants from their mothers, right? And so we need to think about how these institutions are feeding into each other and how inequalities in one area can feed into another area and create a kind of system of structural violence and structural inequality. And we also know that this has a really particular geography. When we look at the correspondence, the correlation between inequalities in the exposure of Black children to foster care relative to the exposure of Black adults to incarceration, we see really tight correlations at the state level. That is, those states that have the highest levels of inequality in family separation through the child welfare system also have the highest levels of inequality in the incarceration of adults. And we see this is true for both Black people and for American Indian people. We see incredibly high levels of incarceration and foster care in those same states. So thank you very much for the time today. I really appreciate you all joining us. I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this work in various papers, Hedwig Lee, Michael Esposito, Sarah Wakefield, Christopher Wildman, Kelly Fong, Micheal Raz, and Karen Healy.
Thank you so much, Frank. We're going to turn now to Andrea.
Thank you. One second. All right, so thank you all. Thanks, Frank, for that great presentation and overview of kind of really highlighting the problem, the extent of the problem, the way in which systems connect. I will be focusing on accountability strategies that have been proposed over the years and over the decades, and presenting some of the evidence around those. I would also just like to thank you all for having me. I definitely have a deep appreciation for reporters and investigative journalists and the work that's done to bring light to what y'all care about. And so for the work that you're doing in this area. And so police reform back decades and are particularly evident when we look at police reform commissions or blue ribbon commissions that have occurred at both the national and local levels, from the 1931 National Commission on Law Observance and Enforcement under President Hoover, which was the first federal review of law enforcement that identified issues of police corruption, excessive force, and abuse of power, to the 1968 National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorder, also known as the Kerner Commission, which was under President Johnson, which identified issues of police brutality, lack of effective complaint systems, as well as many other issues that the community was plagued with. And then the 2015 President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing under President Obama similarly identified problems of police use of force, the need for police accountability, improved, so forth. And so while these are not an exhaustive list of reform efforts, such reforms are often aimed at improving the practices and service delivery of police departments through what I would consider organizational, administrative changes. And often what we see is that a lot of the reform recommendations that have been made are necessarily new, right? And so to me, it really begs the question of evaluating whether or not they work, why we've seen so many reform strategies that have been repeated over the years, what we know about the efficacy of such strategies, reducing the harm and trauma that's caused by police and communities. And so that's really where the crux of my work has fallen. And so some of the historical and contemporary kind of strategies for police reform have included body-worn cameras, which we've seen has really taken off in recent years. Civilian review boards, also known as civilian oversight boards, which have been around for a long time, but vary in the extent to which they have certain powers and authorities. We've seen talk around use of force policies and particularly thinking about the use of force continuum, when certain levels of force should or should not be allowed, and de-escalation. We've seen calls for training, particularly thinking about implicit bias, procedural justice training, for instance. There's calls for hiring officers of color and hiring women in the police force, not just from an equal opportunity perspective, but also to try and get some of the benefits that we use in other professions and in other sectors. And then also we've seen community policing, right? Moving away from a warrior towards a guardian mentality. And of course, this is, again, not an exhaustive list, but some of the commonly touted strategies that have been, at least historically, brought about again and again. And so what does my research as well as others' research tell us about whether these strategies are or not through some of these? And so with regards to community policing, in a review of the literature on community policing from the 70s up until 12, Charlotte Gill pretty much concluded that community policing strategies do have some positive and promising impacts for outcomes that are particularly related to public perceptions, public satisfaction, and police legitimacy, but they have really limited impacts on crime or fear of crime. And we know very little, if anything, on what community policing actually does for racial disparities in policing outcomes. And so there's a real gap in the literature in that. And I can talk about some of the struggles with policing during the Q&A if interested. With regards to bias training, largely outside of the policing literature, kind of there's a good body of evidence that shows that implicit bias training is really sufficient for behavior change. Within policing, there was conducted recently that does improve officers' knowledge and understanding, but has no impact on enforcement outcomes or disparities. Yet again, we see this as a strategy that police departments are continuing to use within their organization. Crisis intervention training has proven to be promising, particularly as it regards to kind of interacting with mentally ill individuals or people who have disability. And there's some evidence that suggests that officers who have undergone crisis intervention training are better at de-escalating and avoiding physical force. But a lot of those studies have been kind of only conducted within the context of like hypothetical vignette situations and not necessarily in the field. With regards to hiring women and officers of color, I have done more work in particular, and I think overwhelmingly, while there's some mixed results, the overwhelming amount of evidence suggests that there are positive benefits for having a more diverse force. And so police will use less force than policemen, and that's usually not associated with increased likelihoods of injuries. They're less likely to engage in controlling or behavior or physical behaviors. With regards to officers of color, there's been studies that have found that having more officers of color on the police force are associated with decreases in crime, complaints, arrests, use of force, particularly when comparing that to white officers, right? And so it's not to say that there's an ideal standard that policing has reached, but at least when benchmarking against white officers in particular, there's been some benefits to having officers of color. With regards to civilian oversight boards, again, there's some research that shows that there's no effective civilian review boards, but more recent research has been able to isolate the types of review boards that make the most difference. And so particularly in cities that have expanded authority for their review boards, have subpoena power, that can be beneficial in impacting certain outcomes like arrests and deadly force. And then with regards to use of force policy specifically, research that suggests that when there's policy restrictive, when discretion is limited, when there's certain types of force, that kind of in the aggregate, it is associated with incidents and reductions in certain types of use of force. And then lastly, with body cameras, there's research here that suggests that body cameras could lead to reductions in use of force. And there's research on the other end that finds that body cameras make no difference, right? That they're not having the intended impacts. And so really the takeaway when assessing all of kind of the reform literature strategies is that more often than not, it really depends on how these strategies are implemented and used in practice, if at all, and often it has to be taken into kind of a larger conversation around and the kind of construction of the criminal justice system in our current society. With that, I think obviously there's been a lot of calls to move funds away from the police and invest into communities and invest in social service provision, invest in health, economic and educational opportunities. And I know you all have probably been doing great work reporting on these demands from the community perspective. But it's important to note, I think from a research perspective, obviously we do not yet know what the cost benefit trade-offs of taking money away from the police, investing in the community. But I think we have some good suggestive evidence that we can pull on. And so while there is research and particularly recent research that police can have crime reduction benefits, particularly with regards to serious crimes like homicides and robberies, that these benefits are not across all, particularly with cities that have the largest populations of Black see those same types of benefits with kind of increased police forces. And it also acknowledges that while there are some benefits, at a cost, right? So we see that there's also with increased police forces that we do see the over-policed communities, particularly with regards to increases in arrests for less serious offenses. And so it's really about asking what costs are we willing to kind of assume with kind of continuing to have the policing at the current state that we have it. And I think Frank really documented well the cost that we're paying for this. And so there's also other that does suggest that social service and community-based safety programs also have crime reduction benefits. And these include programs like Cure Violence and hospital-based interventions, both of which are public health approaches to violence reduction, and they hold promising evidence safety for reducing violence. Research also suggests that when there are more nonprofits focused on reducing violence and building stronger communities and cities, that leads to violent property crime reductions, and that having access to mental health offices can reduce crime, as well as expanded substance abuse treatment centers, right? So all of these kind of thinking about the public health approach to crime prevention, right? To hopefully reduce some reliance on the criminal justice system as a whole. So where to go from? I'd like to kind of end with a few remarks on thinking about this and first thinking about why reform fails and really kind of honing in on the importance of being able to identify and shed light on inhibitors and facilitators. And so we have ideas about the reasons that reform efforts fail, which are related to the implementation of such efforts, particularly with reasons like the politics around things. And so I think there are important questions to ask with regards to how politics interact at different parts of the reform process. And that includes reform within the traditional criminal justice system, as well as when we think about reform outside of the criminal justice system, taking into kind of the social welfare context as a whole. Funding, right? The conversation is on investing, reinvesting, divesting, defunding. But what are the trade-offs when we make calls for defunding the police and then also certain reforms that may require more resources? Employee buy-in is huge when talking about implementation on the ground, right? And so thinking about the culture of the police department as a whole and unpacking that organizational culture that allows for certain reform efforts to not be as effective as they could potentially be. And there's some vagueness as well with regards to reform efforts. And so I am, as a part of the National Police Foundation, working with the council on kind of policing and race. And one of the things that we've heard repeatedly from police departments is them asking for specific things that they can do, not just vague practices saying like engage the community, for instance. And so I think there could be some vagueness here as well. And lastly, when we're thinking about how reporters should assess the reforms in their communities, I am not one person to necessarily tell how to do their job. And so that's not what I mean here, but thinking about things that I think are questions that I think could be important to look into. First is, how do traditional police reforms impact racial disparities specifically? And so often a lot of the research I just talked about is looking at outcomes in the right use of force as a whole. We had Frank who broke down race, specific outcomes, but more often than not, there's not a huge body of literature. This is the impact of specific types of reforms on outcomes disaggregated by race. And so trying to get that disaggregated data and information and stories is really important. Also thinking about what our effects are of reforms that are not accounted for. And so sometimes we think a reform is going to have one impact, and we find later on that it actually has unintended consequences. And I think that's something that the body camera literature is also starting to unpack, to how cameras are used and not used, for instance. What are the community safety programs that are being implemented in your local communities? I have yet to find a comprehensive list of all of the different community programs that are kind of alternatives to the criminal justice system. And so I think that's really important. And then thinking about the community's experience of these reforms specifically. Topher has experienced kind of really portraying that community perspective. And I think it's just so valuable from a kind of storytelling perspective. And so I think that's really important. And then lastly, unpacking why. Why is always something I think I try to do as a researcher, and something that really hard to do, but really is important in trying to move this work forward. And so.
Thank you so much. This is just a fabulous overview and provides so much room for stories and ideas for going forward. We're going to turn now to Topher, who's going to talking about his reporting and reporting strategies.
Thank you, Andrea and Frank. That was amazing, and set the standard really high. And so I'm about to bring it way low. So everybody get ready for that. But let me share my screen and get started. Okay, so I'm gonna focus in on two particular projects that I did with ProPublica, one Walking While Black, and the other very recent reporting that we're still really in the middle of related to NYPD. And that'll be the core way that I focus on. And it's really just to give you guys some insights on the types of strategies that we use to execute both of these projects. One thing that I want to just, talk about quickly, and I'm going to burn through these slides because it's got a limited amount of time, but I want to just highlight the typical versus the atypical as it relates to how we cover policing and how policing is how I've seen policing covered. And we tend to put a lot of energy and a lot of focus into the atypical occurrences at police shops. And those are important. Our police shootings, are times where people are choked and they end up dying, the type of prone asphyxiation events like George Floyd. All of these are super important events. They demand our resources, demand our attention to really unpack them and explain them to the public. But what I find a lot of times, particularly in our local communities, there is not a lot of attention given to the typical ways that communities impact or communicate and deal with police agencies. We're talking about the everyday occurrences, the things that really begin to create rifts between the community and the police. That's where you'll really begin to understand how policing is being done in your community. You can really think about projects and stories, and enterprise looks at those typical occurrences, the way your police agency operates. You'll really start to get your hands around policing in your community. So that takes us to Walking While Black, which is an examination of pedestrian infractions. When on its face, not a super engaging idea or topic, but at scale, and when taking a step back and looking at it, throughout a community over a number of years, you really begin to see how policing works in a place. And so what did we do here for, how did this start? This started with a daily story. A reporter that I know and have a really good relationship wrote a story about a kid who videotaped his encounter with a police officer. And in that, it went viral. On the kid put it on his Facebook account, and then just took off. And just like anything, it was the local news reporters reacting to what was already in the space. People on Facebook, the Black community already were talking about this video. And it showed a cop flanked by two other cops threatening a Black teenager with jail time for a pedestrian ticket. And that went viral. And so I saw it, and I reached out to the reporter. His name's Ben Konark. He did some smart daily reporting, but he didn't have really a thought to take the story beyond that. Called him up and said, "Hey, I think there may be more to this. You down to go on this ride with me?" And we just started digging and looking at the data, and that turned into the series. So one thing that, a note to keep with you as you think about how to do this type of reporting: don't rely on the cops for your data or your information. Doesn't mean that eventually you won't end up back at the cop shop trying to, push for records and push for data. But begin thinking about all the places that you can get the data that is not the cop shop. They're not going to, be a willing participant in providing you this information. At least that's been my experience, both in Florida and in New York. Had to be like tooth and nail to get any information out of the actual cop shop. But a ton of the information that it intersects with the cop shop also intersects with state agencies. So think about how you can get at the information you're interested in through your state agencies. And in the case of Walking While Black, where we ended up receiving about 22 million records from the state, Florida has something called TCATS. It's the entire system of any infraction citation given in the state of Florida. And pedestrian tickets are part of that traffic citation bucket. So we went there, we said we want a big swath, 5-6 years. I forget what it is I requested. And they handed over all that information. And the information came from the Florida comptroller's courts and clerks and comptroller's office. And it wasn't a very complicated request. It was simply, I wanted it for this period to that period. And I told them everything. I didn't restrict it by citations, just to give me the entire database. And in a lot of ways, that's an easier request to fulfill than me giving them something that requires them to write a specific query to slice out some portion of the data for me. So in other states, they have inventories of data like this. I know North Carolina has one. I believe Maryland has one. So you just have to look into your state, find out, do they keep this big trove of data like this at the state level? And that allows you to examine your local agency, and you haven't even knocked on the door yet. And so that's a way that I like to get into. And this is how some of the data looks. This is super cleaned up, but this is what it looks like. And there's a bunch of other columns that you don't see here. But in Florida, super clean. I'll tell you, I've seen this data in North Carolina, not clean at all. So, you'll have to look at the shape of the data once you get it and see, based on your own skills and whatever data reporters you're working with, you can wrangle the data into shape that'll work for you. Listen to the cops. So I mean this in a couple of ways. Often I talk to other reporters, younger reporters, and they have aggressive plans for covering some police issue. And then I ask them, all right, cool. What's up? What do your cop sources tell you? And I don't have any cop sources. So if you're out here doing this reporting and you're going to do aggressive takes on how policing works in your community, you have to develop cop sources. You have to be able to talk to the cops and understand how they see their duties, what are they being told by top brass? What are the precinct commanders telling them in roll call? Like, that's the only way to learn the ins and outs of how the cops are operating, is to actually talk to them. And that, when I say that, not just the top brass for comments, but it's developing those sources, those folks with boots on the ground who are actually doing the police work. You have to learn and understand how rank and file see these issues and how they kind of are executing these commands that they're being given. That's the way you really start to learn about these processes. So when we took our questions about Walking While Black in Jacksonville to the top brass there and began asking them questions about some of the initial findings in the data, which was just showing disproportionality of the tickets being given to Black pedestrians. When we did that, one thing that the number two at the shop told us, well, obviously Black folks jaywalk more. And that was his answer for why there was a disproportionality in the data. And then, once we took that and I walked out and I was not pleased with that response, I then said, well, how can we vet that? Is there a way for us to actually vet whether or not Black folks, jaywalk more? So we kicked that around with the data shop and we came up with some cool ideas on how to kick the tires on that. But also said, well, do cops jaywalk? I said to myself. And we were able to do some stakeouts and find that, of course, cops in uniforms jaywalk all the time. And we took good video and we took lots of photos and we showed that video and photos to the police officers in charge of JSO to get their kind of take on it. Then they came back to us and they said, oh, we're doing this to save lives. All right, well, how do we vet the save lives perspective? Well, what we did was we took the location of the tickets and then we took the locations of the places where people were killed, and we did a correlation analysis to see whether or not they lined up. Were they related? The places that they actually gave tickets, was that the location of the places where people were being killed, pedestrians being killed by automobiles? And, to no surprise, we found out that wasn't altogether true. So here are, a breakdown of the tracks, the census tracks, and how the percent Black, the census track was, and then the number of fatal car crashes, fatal pedestrian deaths in those census tracts. And you see that there's a pretty even distribution upon the deaths around the county, right? And it doesn't really change the blacker the census tract is. But the blacker the census tract, the more tickets they were handing out there, as you can see that. And so it was very clear to us that this is, we were able to kind of debunk that and show that this is really a policing tactic and not not meant to try to save people's lives. Also, we wanted to look at who was dying in pedestrian accidents, and they were significantly, we used death certificates. In Florida, you can get those. We requested every single one over like a 5 or 6 year period. And we looked at, who that person was, their demographic. And again, no surprise, they were significantly older than the people they were giving tickets to. And they were significantly whiter than the people that they were giving tickets to. And so also did not appear to line up that they were out there trying to save lives. So finding real people, how did we do that? It was right there in the data, right? So you would be able to identify the individual's names. We would get the location of the ticket, and we were able to kind of, use enough of that in some of our services to kind of find people and ask them if they were willing to talk about the day that they received this ticket. Also, we used lawyers. Lawyers were instrumental to helping us point out to people who had to deal with these tickets. The benefit of sometimes using lawyers is that you're more than likely going to find someone who has contested the issue. And so someone who already put up a fight about this, and they're probably really willing and ready to talk to you. And other real people. So once we identified one person who had dealt with this, they were willing to connect us to 2 or 3 that they knew that had dealt with this, because they did this enforcement in little pockets and zones. So the one person got a ticket, they knew of 3 other 4 folks that got a ticket either with them in that same time frame, or that got tickets in a week or 2 before that. So other real people helped connect us to other real people. And here are two examples of folks that we were able to talk to using the data and using lawyers. To the left, you see John Kendrick. We got him through a lawyer, and he had a really unfortunate story of trying to park his truck and running into a cop who didn't like him trying to enter the zone where the cops were trying to regulate the traffic. They had like an argument, and he stepped off of the sidewalk, and that gave the cop impetus to throw him to the ground, arrest him, and then give him a traffic citation. And he ended up fighting traffic citation, but it was stepping off of the sidewalk that was allowed the officer to say, okay, now you've violated this pedestrian citation, I'm going to arrest you. And Miss Naomi Martinez, she ran into the most prolific officer in Jacksonville for giving out these type of tickets when she endeavored to walk around a flooded part of sidewalk. It was raining and the sidewalk had flooded, so she went to walk around it, walked into the street. He saw her, he barked some orders at her. She said, no, you don't have to speak to me that way. And then he gave her a ticket for it. And when we found Miss Martinez, we knocked on her door. The day we went to see her, she had an eviction notice on her door. She had no furniture in her apartment. We sat on some egg crates and we talked. And this was, these were the types of circumstances she was dealing with. And this ticket, $73 or so, may seem like small potatoes to me or you, but it was a big deal to her. And so oftentimes the people on the other end of these typical interactions with police are people who really cannot afford even these types of pedestrian tickets. And so lastly, we use Google Street View to identify bad tickets. We had been told by one of our sources that the cops don't even know how to give these tickets. And so we looked at, was that true? And so this is a complicated thing to explain, but in the state of Florida, what you're looking at here in place B in the state of Florida, that is, it is not permissible for you to cross the street in location B. It's outruled by state law. But in location A, it is okay for you to cross the street in location A. But cops don't know that, they don't understand that, and they give tickets and infractions at location A like nobody's business. So we endeavored to do an evaluation of a large swath of these tickets in the biggest counties, and we used Google Street View to do that. We simply went to the location of the ticket, went into Google Street View, and use Google Street View to see the civic engineering of the location and whether it fit the parameters of the law. And we were able to identify good and bad tickets. And in doing that, we presented findings to several different police shops. Some of them threw out the tickets. Jacksonville did not. But many of these tickets also led to other types of charges because they're using it in kind of a stop and frisk manner. So they see someone commit this infraction, they encounter them, say, oh, hey, you just violated blah, 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 blah. Yo, empty your pockets, you got any warrants, da, 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 da. So we highlighted this to the public defender in Jacksonville, and they went and trained all the lawyers on how to identify these tickets so that they could then attack it legally, where it's kind of a fruit of the poison tree type of a thing. So we found that some 60% of the time they gave this ticket in the 4 largest counties, it was bad. It was not accurate. Our NYPD burned through this real quick. What happened with NYPD in last year is that we had a reporter who about 2 years ago watched a group of officers chase down a kid on Halloween, and they were really aggressive, and they threw some kids up against some walls, another on a tree, and they used a car technique to kind of run in front of some kids. He wrote all this up in the first person. He's a managing editor at ProPublica, and his endeavor to track what happened with his complaint about those officers that led him to wanting to investigate CCRB, which is the Civilian Review Complaint Board in New York City. And doing that, he was able to get in a small period of time where they repealed a law that did not allow us to get those records. There was about a month where it was repealed right after George Floyd died. They did this in the governor repealed 50A is what they call it here in New York. They repealed it. It was there for about a month before the unions filed lawsuit to kind of for an injunction, and we were able to get a big swath of the data. From that, we were able to examine civilian complaints in New York City. It led to us writing a story about one particular guy who rose high in the ranks, and we learned that he liked to strip search people throughout his entire career. Even when he became a precinct commander, he was still out there strip searching people. Super weird. We wrote about it, and it was well received. And then also we use it to examine the state of chokeholds after Eric Gardner's death. So we looked at all of the chokehold complaints that came in after Eric Gardner's death to try to see what we could learn about those chokeholds. And what we learned was basically that the CCRB would find that those chokeholds were, sustained. Those complaints were sustained, but there would be very little discipline. And last, we looked at the watchdogs. Who's looking at NYPD? And there's a newly erected outfit called the Inspector General in New York, dates back to 2014. And we evaluated, did they have access that they need? And learned that they're treated often like the press, and they do not have the access that they need. So that sums up my little presentation.
Thank you so much. That's really chilling and very, very helpful. We're going to turn now to everybody's questions. We have a couple now in the Q&A, but if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A in Zoom at the bottom of your toolbar, and we'll try to take as many as we can. And I'll ask our speakers if they can kind of come back on the screen. And maybe, Topher, do you mind to take down your PowerPoint so then we can just see all of our speakers? And start out with a question from Tony Weingarten, who says, if Black men have 1/1000th chance of being killed by police, what is the rate or ratio for white men?
Yeah, so it's about 1 in 2,500. So the overall rate for men in the United States is about 1 in 2,000. The rate for white men in particular is about 1 in 2,500. So the risk is 2.5 times lower or Black men's risk is 2.5 times higher than white men's risk. Also, briefly to comment on Jody Housen's question, I think this is, have you found any communities doing at least a reasonably good job of equalizing the situation? The answer to that is it's really hard to tell because a lot of these efforts are quite new, and the data is of relatively low quality in terms of comparing across places. But I know Andrea, I'm sure, has much more to say about particular reform efforts.
Let me just go back to Jody's question, which is, have any of you found communities that are doing at least a reasonably good job of equalizing the situation? And if so, where are they and what are they doing? Andrea, did you want to weigh in on that one as well?
Yeah, I completely agree with Frank. I would just maybe add that I think that there are certain communities that are doing specific types of strategies, right? Or there are certain communities, whether that's within the criminal justice system or thinking about community public safety, right? There's certain initiatives that we can point to saying, the Cahoots program has gotten a lot of attention, for instance, right? And so that impacts a very specific type of outcome, though. And so when we ask this question, I think it's really important to think about what outcome we're referring to, because a lot of times the strategies are outcome specific and they get talked about like that they're going to just kind of solve policing and race in the United States, but it's like, no, it's specific to, mental health or substance abuse instances, or specific to stop and frisk or to chokeholds, right? But that doesn't necessarily get at the larger problem of the ways in which kind of Topher pointed out the everyday harm that's endured by everyday police practices. And so I think it is much more nuanced when we get to specific types of outcomes as well, in trying to do kind of the best case.
And Topher, did you have any situations where you found a police department that had made some constructive reforms, or other journalism you've seen that pointed to some positive examples?
No, mainly come in and look at problems with what I do.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, one of the things so striking about your reporting is you just sort of took every argument that the police offered and took it apart and tested it, and it didn't seem like any of the rationales really held. I mean, it's quite a remarkable process that you went through, and your findings are as well. We have a question from Mark Obi, suggestions for journalists on best ways to stay abreast of latest research on which responses to abuses are effective or not.
I'm interested in this question as well.
I think that's the challenge of just keeping up with, in particular, the academic literature. I think there's a lot of lower quality research that's coming out that's claiming to do evaluation that isn't rigorous right now. And I think, particularly when we think about things like deaths, there's a lot of noise in a death count, right? So it's really hard over a short term to make any, especially for a single department, to make any judgments about whether something has been effective or not. And I think this is an area where I would really, find some reliable people, especially in criminology or in public affairs, who study the questions of police efficacy. I think Professor Headley is a great person to get as one source for that kind of work. But I think it's really just a question of keeping up with the academic literature, because there's a lot of people who are looking at those questions right now.
And Andrea, do you have any suggestions for how people can sort of track this research on what's effective and what's not?
I agree that that is a hard question to answer. I think there's a part of it's on kind of the researchers. We can do a better job of probably putting our research out there. And I know that's not obviously a specific answer to what reporters can do. But the one, in terms of a practical, in terms of just trying to see, I think assessing the quality of research is like the second once you find out what the research is in the first place. And so maybe to find out the research, like Google Scholar Alerts is an easy way to just kind of like put an alert to try and track recent research. And if you start finding people that you really like their work, like Frank, for instance, and you put a Google Scholar Alert, I think that's a way to keep up with it. And then trying to assess the quality would be the second step. And because I think that's right. When oftentimes in the work that I've done in trying to take an overture is you can find literature that says kind of that are on both sides of the fence, right? So, oh, it works, or oh, it doesn't work. You have to do the work to try to read the literature and actually understand what is exactly is being analyzed, how it's being done, what they're assessing, et cetera. But I think for a practical tip, I would say maybe just like putting the reports could be a good first step in doing them. And then I think there's some clearinghouses actually now, research clearinghouses that have been like what works, evidence-based. And another scholar named Jennifer Doliak has a blog where she's putting evidence-based crime strategies and reform efforts on her website. And so I think that can also be another one.
If I may, I also wanted to plug Philatiba Goff's work, and the Center for Policing Equity is a great resource that's really, really laser focused on reducing racism in policing. And I think that's a great resource to check.
And Frank and Andrea, could you put those names in the chat? There's a way where you could do it so it goes to everybody, just so we make sure we have their names. And Andrea, the other thing I was struck by, to your point about these questions of effectiveness, when you were going over your slides, you were making this point that so much of these results are mixed. And it was kind of discouraging, I think, to hear that. I mean, given the decades that these questions have been examined, and you've done a lot of research on the body cameras, is there anything that you feel, just as a methodology, is most promising, and what are the nuances there?
Most promising for body camera specific?
No, as an intervention, because you were saying community policing, there's so much that's really murky about how well it works in terms of the disparate outcomes and so on. It's just sort of like all these things that are being trumpeted as, this is the path, we need more this, more that. And then what you were sharing with us was that we don't even really know if some of these central pillars of what's supposed to be reform are effective. That was pretty striking, I thought, in your research. So what encourages you, I guess, as we go forward?
Yeah. I will say it is very discouraging. That's exactly how I feel having done, but I think it's discouraging, but it also makes us question, right? Regardless of kind of where you stand on the movement to defund, if we know that there are strategies that are continuing to be proposed that are not necessarily effective, like it does make us question rethinking the way in which we approach justice. But specifically, I think there's some strategies that I am particularly excited to see evaluated. And so I don't think that there's a clear yes or no, does it work, but there active bystander kind of intervention training program that I've gotten involved in. Lots of police departments are starting to do this active bystandership training and trying to reform, kind of thinking about the way in which officers intervene to stop problematic officers, and because obviously there's a culture in police departments in themselves that allow for a lot of the corruption and misuse and abuse to continue. And so thinking about ways to disrupt that, we don't have evaluations on that in a rigorous manner yet, but a lot of states are passing laws on requiring it as well. And so I think it's something that I'm interested to see what will happen with, because I think that's a really interesting idea of trying to get people to intervene, and to what extent that could work. But again, I think that still is probably going to be very specifically tied to certain types of situations and certain types of outcomes, really fixing all of the different problems that we see in policing and the justice system overall.
Thank you. And we have a question from Marla Fain. A question for Dr. Headley. Is there any evidence that since the George Floyd death, the initial momentum for reform has begun to wane?
I'm not sure if there's evidence on that. I personally haven't like the different legislations and localities are. And so maybe, I don't know if Frank or Topher have a better answer for tracking those, but I think what kind of what we see is that there is more momentum when, you know, these events happen. And I think that there are some places that are probably kind of keep trying to keep that momentum, and other places that have fallen off. But I personally haven't kind of tracked that to know in a system way whether we see consistent declines or what have you.
And we have a question. I'm sorry, go ahead, Frank. Were you going to say something?
Just really briefly, I mean, I think, you know, there's some numbers I've seen on that look at like the counts of bills introduced in state legislatures and things like that. And I think that can be misleading because it does depend on how much is already on the books in different states. And so I think, you know, the counts are I'm suspicious of, but I think one thing that's clear is you look at like Minneapolis and what's going on with initial promises to, you know, disband the Minneapolis Police Department after his death. I mean, I think that the intensity and the sort of radicalness of proposals declines as the movements in the streets demobilize, right? Not saying they're demobilized now, but obviously the intensity of protest activity last summer and the rebellions last summer was something unprecedented in US history. And so that created a real political crisis that has waned a bit and is less urgent for many legislatures.
We have a question from Deepak Prem Kumar, who says, aside from the officer-involved fatalities recorded in places in fatal encounters, are you aware of any large data sets that cover more than one municipality related to policing that comes from data not generated by police?
That's a great question. So it's difficult. So there are tens of thousands of police agencies in the United States, and each of them have their own internal data. So police data is just a nightmare in terms of trying to work with. So I just posted a link to the Open Policing Project at Stanford. They're a great shop that has cobbled together a number of data sets, both official and unofficial. And a lot of times those are going to be individual police department or state agencies that are aggregating their data in, similar to what Topher mentioned and looking at the Florida data. So that shops like that, there's a few clearinghouses. The team behind Mapping Police Violence, led by Samson Youngway, produced a series of report cards on police agencies that aggregate data from a number of census and other federal data sets, including unofficial data. So those are interesting, but it's often very fragmented. And so police killings are something that are relatively easy to track using news reports. Other kinds of policing outcomes are far more difficult to comprehensively track using the methodology that people like Fatal Encounters or the Washington Post have used, which rely on your hard work to report on police violence, police killings.
And Topher, did you want to add to that? I know that to your point about the everyday interactions, some reporters have gone into the civilian complaints to see how they were reconciled, but were there other things you might want to add?
No, I think you got to just go with what you're hearing the community talk about, right? You know, you'll be able to hear the community talk about either, you know, warrants being executed or whatever the issue of the day is for that community, and you'll find a way to find some data about that. This has been my experience to do that, and not the fatalities or, you know, the chocos and the deaths, just kind of these other ways that police do their job.
Thank you. We have a question from Sheila D. What strategies are best to unpack police abuses noted during George Floyd's uprising? City leaders and DA promised changes, yet there have not been answers. And how do you unpack police unions as they impact changes or the lack of fixes in cop culture?
So I'm not completely sure I understood the question, but if the question, part of the question's about penetrating police unions, that's a sourcing thing. From my standpoint, the job that I do, it's about your sources, and it's about who you're putting time and resources into developing. I think that, again, I find that people who cover cops tend to have somewhat of a barrier about engaging officers beyond just firing hard questions at them. So if you can develop officers and develop them as good sources, they may be able to bring you into the union fold. You may be able to learn who are the friendlies inside the union. There may be some ready to talk to you. You just have to get out there and let them know that you want to talk to them.
Anybody else, Frank or Andrea? I'm sorry, Frank, you were going to say something.
Just really briefly, I mean, I'm generally skeptical of efforts to use the criminal legal system to hold officers accountable in terms of just whether that's going to be a systematic response that we see, for example, the officers in Buffalo who pushed the elderly man to the ground and cracked his skull, right? Those officers are not going to be subject to meaningful discipline of this that would be appropriate to the kind of violence that was carried out. And I think that's generally true, that the criminal legal system operates as a whole, and courts and prosecutors' offices are really tightly intertwined with the police agencies. And I think the conviction of Derek Chauvin is quite exceptional. Those kinds of convictions are incredibly rare, much less charges being filed. So I think, following up on what happens to officers after particularly egregious cases of abuse is a valuable thing to do in reporting, but I wouldn't expect that we would see much come through the courts.
Thank you. We have a question from Yenchi Shu, who says many Black Lives Matter protesters have been charged with misdemeanors in North Carolina, and our legislature just advanced bills to limit riots and protests. There seems to be a push for law enforcement officers to have even more power when people are protesting police brutality. What are some questions we need to ask them? Ofer, do you want to try that one?
I mean, naturally for me, I just want to know what evidence they're basing any of the, the new laws on. They're passed now, so it's still going to be something that people who want to hit the streets are going to have to deal with. But I think as a reporter, I would look to see if there's any foundation, if it sits on any strong foundation. And if it doesn't, I'd like to pull that apart and at least just expose that and show that to readers that, these laws are built on a house of cards and that they're not really looking to address any real problems. They're just being pushed for political reasons. As a reporter, that's all you have, is you can ask those questions that kind of expose the fallacy of it all.
I'd like to echo that. And I think the other thing you could do is think about comparative work, to think about similar laws in non-US contexts and how those would be perceived by, for example, political scientists who study state repression and, authoritarian political regimes. To me, that's a perspective that doesn't get brought in often enough. They often get taken on their face. Is this about public safety or not, rather than taken as a universe of policy solutions that we know are very much in the repertoire of authoritarian governance.
And just take a final question here because we're running over, which is, how do you think the new laws about protesting will impact community responses to policing, and how can we track them? Anybody want to?
Yeah, could you read that question again? I just want to.
Sure. How do you think the new laws about protesting, such as the one in North Carolina, the other person asked, will impact community response to policing, and how can we track the impact of that? These laws limiting protests.
Yeah, I think that I like Frank's idea about comparative kind of outcomes. you can do that across states too. If you have the resources to do that, you can look and see what the impact was in one state versus another state of all these new laws that are coming online. But as far as whether it's going to impact community response, I have no idea. I hope not. I think that if the community is not happy about something, they should make their voices known. But I have no way of knowing. I guess we won't know. Only time will tell.
Yeah, I would just add, and if I find the link, I'll maybe send it to someone. But there was this kind of really well done tracker of protests that have happened since like Ferguson up until now, and I think they're continuing to update it. I could be wrong though, but that I think is a really good foundation for seeing, okay, we're passing if we start seeing differences with regards to the protests, just to understand that impact that Frank was talking about in terms of the comparative perspective. I think there was a couple of that I remember seeing doing that. But the second say, and this kind of maybe goes really to a strategy that Topher recommended during his presentation, and think the community response, I think really putting the feet to the ground to understand that impact from the community perspective and talking to the individuals who are most impacted by the laws, which would be people who want to be vocal, activist organizations, et cetera, and then seeing from them also what the strategies are, how they're navigating it, things like that, I think are really, so getting that perspective, I think would be important to really understand the impact.
Yeah, I want to second what Andrea just mentioned. I think a lot of those laws are really designed to target leaders of these organizations and hit them with heavy charges and jail time and prison time for that are strategic ways to try and dismantle these organizations. And I think the question will be, how do individuals who face these charges respond to it? How do the organizations that they're part of respond to it? I often think about, the leaders in Ferguson, many of whom have turned up dead under mysterious circumstances in the years following the uprising. And I think it's really important to think about not these as spontaneous uprisings, but as coming from people and communities and organizations that are going to be subject to these things over time, and we can follow that.
Well, I want to thank our three panelists for these really illuminating presentations, which have provided so many ideas for work going forward. And I also want to thank all the participants who joined us for their excellent questions. As a reminder, we'll be archiving this webinar and all the slides a little later today on centerforhealthjournalism.org. And if you would like to support our continued work with these webinars, please just send a text to 41444 and type CHJ. And we'll be sending you a survey shortly asking you for your feedback on this webinar and your ideas for other ones. So please do participate. And thank you all so much for joining us, and I wish you a good day.